Alright, the goal of this video is just to give you a quick overview of how to deal with IPv4 subnets and calculate their values. Just to get started with our key terms, an octet is each 1 byte part of a 4 byte IPv4 address. We just break that down easily. Simply put, it's the number between each dot. We also have our dotted decimal form and our binary form. We're going to be dealing with the binary form mostly for this. Then next up is a subnet. A subnet is just an octet which has been divided into multiple different networks. And typically in a business, these subnets are given to either individual buildings or individual departments for security reasons and management. And then next up is CIDR, which is a /26 here. This just tells us the first 26 bits of this IP address are reserved for telling us what the network is. And then for our next step, we've got to figure out where that 26 actually ends. So you could count the first 26 bits of this IP address. That's a bit too much work for me though. We know the /26 is in the last 8 bits of the IP address. Or the simplest method, without needing to think about it, is you take your CIDR number, you just keep subtracting 8 from it until you get to a number less than 8, 2 in this case. This tells us the first 2 bits of the last octet are reserved for the network. Now if we take this binary form we just made and put it in dotted decimal, you'll see a subnet mask, which will probably be something you've seen before. Now our first step of actually calculating the subnet is to determine how many devices can go on each subnetwork. So the mathematical way of doing this is 2 to the power of how many host bits there are, so in this case 2 to the power of 6. Or the quick way of doing it, in the last octet specifically, you just look left of the red line where the network bits begin, and then that number is the amount of host bits you can have. Now the key thing here is that's the total amount of hosts, not the usable amount. The network ID at the start of every network is not usable, same for the broadcast IP address. And then our next step is to determine how many networks we can actually have inside this subnet. So the best way to do this is just do 2 to the power of how many host bits you have, in this case 2, which is 4 networks. Based on the last slide, we know there's 64 hosts on each network. We can write this down in a table just to make life easier for later. Now another method of determining network ID is we just take all the host bits and we set them to 0. This will tell us that the .42 IP address is in the first subnet with the network ID of that subnet being 0. And then just to find the broadcast ID, we set all the host bits to 1, and the quick way of figuring out what that number is we just look at our red line, number to the left of that minus 1 will give us our broadcast ID. And then it's quite similar with the subsequent subnets as well. We just set the network bit to what subnet we're up to, and then we add that number to our final IP address. So in this case, +63 +64, that gives us our .127 as our broadcast ID for the second subnet. And then just to conclude, so far we've gathered this information. You would repeat these steps for each of the 4 subnets in this network, which would give you all the subsequent departments and their IP address ranges.